Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Insights by Indicio. I'm your host, Tim Spring, and today I'm joined by Indicio's Deputy CTO, Sam Curren, and VP of Communications and Governance, Trevor Butterworth. Over the past few weeks, we've been kind of taking a deep dive into governance, and today we're going to explore a slightly related but slightly new topic, which is what is an ecosystem? So thank you both for joining me today. Before we jump in, I feel it's kind of important that we highlight, kind of why we're here and why do you want an ecosystem before we explain kind of what it is. Let's touch on one more time, just what are the benefits to having one before you decide what it is and how to make one.
Well, let me start by saying you already have one. You may not recognize it, but you're already in an ecosystem. You have business relationships, you have contracts, you have suppliers, you have customers. You already have the elements of an ecosystem, but you may not be worth thinking about it like that. So that's important to realize is that when we talk about ecosystems, we're talking about generally things that already exist. When we're talking about different types of ecosystems, we're talking about adding those features to the existing ecosystems you have, rather than generally making new ones. New ones do emerge. Companies get started, consortiums are created, et cetera. But we're often talking about adding, the technology and the trust and verifiable credentials and relationships and all those things to existing ecosystems, the ones you've already got.
I think it's a shorthand way that we use to describe what happens when you have an issuer, you have a bunch of people or things or organizations holding credentials, and you have one or more organizations or people or things verifying credentials. And we sort of, the thing is that we refer to that as an ecosystem, but in reality, we're just simply mapping relationships that already exist with this new fantastic technology.
All right. And I think that was kind of, the heart of what I was trying to get at, Trevor, is why do you want to adapt this new technology if, like Sam said, we've got the ecosystems already? I know who I'm buying my apples from, for example.
Well, there are many reasons. We exist now in a sort of hybrid digital analog world in which we constantly need to prove who we are talking to in order for that interaction to be trusted. And verifiable credentials, which is the sort of the signature product of the broader concept of decentralized identity, is the way to do that. It's a way to prove identity and to prove any data that might be associated with that identity. And as a result, this is a sort of, it's almost like a rewiring of how we digitally interact and how we also, which is increasingly how we interact in the real world. Sam, further thoughts on that?
We've seen a number of impersonation attacks recently that have resulted in huge amounts of fraud via, people tricked into wiring money where they shouldn't because of AI-driven conversations with people that weren't who they thought they were. Supply chain fraud is another thing. And so even if we have existing business relationships, we need to inject the trust that we have in the actual business relationship into the ongoing operations of that relationship. So just because I trust Trevor to mail me the thing that he says he would, often injecting trust into the rest of the process is really where most of the fraud occurs. And there's a huge amount of potential for cost savings because of fraud reduction in those cases, as well as is increasing some of the things we can't do today simply because we just don't trust the communication or the transportation tools that we actually have today.
So yeah, there are two dimensions to this. There's the trust that dispels the risk of fraud. I mean, I even now, when I get, like, say, my broadband company calling me up to talk about my, my account and and I'm like, I'm not even sure, given the extent of phishing attacks, given the volume that we're seeing right now, I'm not even, I'm like, I'm not giving you any data because I don't really know that it's you. And AI is just going to make this, and deepfakes are just going to make this epically worse. I mean, we are looking at chaos. And of course, this is what verifiable credential technology can just solve it. But the way it solves it also represents the other dimension to this technology, which is that it streamlines and simplifies what are otherwise complex processes. And an obvious example is that once, if you issue a credential with certain kind of data, say KYC or mortgage data or financial data, whatever, once you trust the source of that data, which of course you can with this technology, then you can trust the data in the credential, because we have a way of ensuring that any tampering would be revealed. And therefore, you can reuse this data. You don't have to keep generating the same proofs, the same paper documents over and over again. And so that represents a kind of massive simplification of digital interaction, which of course brings a ton of savings, a ton of efficiencies, reduces error, again, along with all the other dimension of fraud resistance. So, sorry, there's a third dimension. There's data protection compliance. So you have that thrown into the mix, which is also a cost saver for companies, but it also empowers consumers and empowers organizations because they're able to control their data and consent to who they share it with. So yeah, that's why you want an ecosystem of verifiable credentials.
Okay, so right, obviously those sound like great things to have. Sam, you mentioned you kind of already have an ecosystem. How would you transfer that ecosystem into being made of these verifiable credentials? Is there going to be any kind of, it goes offline over here, comes up over there? How do you, make those steps and create that transformation digitally?
Yeah, so it's important to recognize the participants in an ecosystem, and then which of those participants need to adopt which technologies and play which roles in the ecosystem. So there's a handful of roles. In the credential ecosystem, we talk about 3 roles in any given transaction, which is an issuer, a holder, and a verifier of credentials. So a credential issuer, a credential holder, and a credential verifier. It's important to recognize that that diagram is meant to show a single interaction, not only the interactions that can happen between those parties. And so in an ecosystem, frequently, you'll have someone that issues credentials, they hold credentials of their own, and they also verify credentials from other organizations or entities. And so that's important to recognize, is that those are not roles within the ecosystem, they are roles within any individual interaction. Having said that, particularly in early ecosystems, people are going to fall generally into one of those 3 roles. So you can think about it a little bit simplistically in that way. So there's an issuer of verifiable credentials, and this is the party probably in your existing ecosystem. This is the authoritative source for some amount of data. There's the verifier, who is the recipient of that data that needs to be able to verify that it's authentic and then acts on that data. And then there's the holder, and this is generally new maybe in your ecosystem because often holders have not previously been involved in the information flow, but they are with verifiable credentials. That solves a number of compliance things that Trevor mentioned, because you don't have to worry about achieving permission to access data when the user actually hands it to you. If the user hands it to you, that is, of course, consent for you to use the data for the purpose that you've agreed upon. And so that simplifies compliance with a lot of regulation, particularly privacy regulation as it relates to people. So recognizing who in your ecosystem is already the authorities for those things helps. There's one other party that I haven't talked about yet, and that's the ecosystem authority for governance. And who that is depends on what type of an ecosystem it is. If you have a small ecosystem where there's one source of data and a number of consumers, a number of verifiers of that data, then generally the issuer is often the governing authority of that ecosystem. They set the rules about how the information can be used, who they're going to share it with, et cetera, and they're the only source of that data. If you have something that's more like an industry consortium or some other composite group like that, you often have that organization serves as the governance authority, and then the participants in it play either the roles of issuers or verifiers or both, depending on the operations of the ecosystem. But that's probably already an authority that already exists in your ecosystem. If you have a consortium, for example, there's already someone who runs a consortium. And so they would be the authority. So when you look at transitioning an existing ecosystem into a verifiable credential ecosystem or a trusted data ecosystem, what you're doing is identifying the parties that are already performing those roles now, and then they adopt the technology that allows them to speak verifiable credential, if you will, and use these other protocols and technologies. And then they do the same things they do now, only leverage the technologies that enable this to have extra abilities that it hasn't had before in order to do so. And that's how an existing ecosystem transfers from what you have today into an ecosystem that engages in trust and data in the exchange of verifiable credentials.
So I really liked what you were talking about there, Sam, and kind of changing the way everyone internally gets to communicate and really, talk to one another. I was wondering if you might be able to give us an example and really drill deep into how it will make, the communication, better, faster, stronger, for lack of a better term, more direct and really just change the way, in a meaningful way for them, change how they interact with each other. So you mentioned consortiums. Is there any way that you could say exactly like how it works inside a consortium?
Yeah, and of course, I'm providing generalized examples, and more specific, applications can be determined with a closer inspection. But absolutely. So in my hometown growing up, there was a dairy in the middle of town, and they had it was a cooperative creamery, and they had relationships with dairy farms in the area, and those dairy farms would then milk their cows, and they would send the milk to the cooperative dairy as a consortium, and they would then make milk products, out of it, cheese and other things, as you do, and butter, and they would then sell those things as part of that larger consortium. There were separate companies. The farms themselves were independent, and then the cooperative creamery that they created was is a company in its own right, as an organization. And so in this particular situation, the governance authority would be the creamery, right? And this is a relatively common pattern. I know of at least one other, and that's the well-known Tillamook cheese factory, that operates under the same model. So the authority in a governance ecosystem like that, the governance authority is the cooperative themselves. They derive their authority from the buy-in and the creation of the members. So they often have boards, for example, that are elected by the dairies themselves to represent the interests of the dairies in the operation. And so the dairy can issue credentials to participating farms that certify that they are members of the consortium. This is the electronic version, for example, of a sign that you might see by a dairy that says, we're a member of this particular cooperative. And those exist in the real world, and the ability to also communicate those electronically is very useful. For example, they can provide that information to inspectors that are coming to inspect the dairy, or as they're perhaps looking to make a sale of the dairy itself. They're able to communicate their associative memberships as well to potential buyers. They can also use those credentials that they've been given in order to communicate securely back to the cooperative. So as I mentioned, they are generally a board of directors that oversee the operation and protect the interests of the dairy farmers, and they can use those credentials to prove who they are in order to cast their vote in elections like that. And so, rather than much more unofficial ways of doing it that are open to either human error, meaning unintentional, or fraud, meaning intentional manipulation of the data, that information can sort that out, and you can prove electronically, either in person or online, that you are the party that represents the farm itself. And so that's a good example of that. Further in the ecosystem, if you have, say, environmental reports that are gathered by the farms, those can actually be transmitted to the cooperative in a way that is trusted, even though the reports didn't come from the individual, investigating parties themselves. They can be aggregated together, and that data can be trusted inside of the cooperative because of the source of the data being the inspectors in that ecosystem as it occurs. And so that bleeds a little bit, because the whole ecosystem of like farm inspections can be an ecosystem of its own, but it ties together really well. It also highlights a really important point, is that you're not building a wall around the ecosystem so that no one else can actually work along with you. In fact, some of the best benefits of this technology come from working across the boundaries of ecosystems in larger cooperative manners. And so it's important to recognize that. But in that case, you have a very large dairy, that contracts with dozens or even hundreds of dairy farms, and they can use this technology to reliably share data back and forth. Here's another example. When you have a milk truck that comes from a dairy and then drops off at the dairy farm and drops off at the dairy, they want to record what you actually, how much milk was actually received. There's further testing to verify the quality and the purity of the milk, for example. And those can also be issued as verifiable credentials, which can be passed directly back to the farmer. And now you have a verifiable record that can be trusted by both parties of the actual transaction that took place. And that, of course, is based upon the foundations of the ecosystem and the identities that are issued and created on top of that existing ecosystem.
Well, possibly even more exciting is how you could use verifiable credentials to track livestock. The need to identify livestock for safety reasons is huge. And here you have a reliable, simple to implement way to do that, which you can transmit this data to the relevant authorities frictionlessly. So I mean, once you start unpacking a use case, then you can see how the transitive trust that exists within an issuer holder relationship can be extended to a huge number of use cases. But a simpler example is, think about, most employees have a little tag to say that, who they are. You can issue that as a verifiable credential, and you'll always know who who your employee is and what system they're logging into and whether they have permission to access this particular office or device or system. But you can also use that credential. You could approve a list of benefit partners who can then manage all the benefit aspects of your employee's life in a seamless way, because they know for certain that Joe Schmo is an employee of the Acme company and not somebody who's stolen their ID.
And that's a single company, right? Every company has to manage employees and provide access to things. And so that's on the smaller end of the spectrum, but a really good example that there aren't really size limitations to the applicability of this technology.
Okay, so I'm interested, right, in how you define, for lack of a better term, the borders of an ecosystem, right? So as soon as you start, let's say in the small company, you've issued your employees credentials. And now, right, you've got some partner organizations. Do their employees also get some kind of credentials, and where does it end, right? Because then they can also spread to the next person. It sounds like it would be a never-ending ecosystem in my mind, potentially.
Big E ecosystem, yes. Little E ecosystem, there's all over the place. And so every company, for example, has a little ecosystem of trust and identity that they use within their company. And so when you have, you gave the example of the employees of, for example, the Benefits Management Corporation, they will as well. One of the great things about governance is that it's possible to share the governance details between organizations in a very simple way. Decentralized ecosystem governance is a mechanism by where you can publish the details of your ecosystem that can be read by others. And this is a great way to promote actual cooperation outside of your boundaries. You often want people to be able to understand and consume those credentials. A really simple example is verifying of law enforcement credentials, for example. So if a cop shows up at my door, it's incredibly easy now to impersonate service workers or a police officer. And that might be really hard to do. But in this case, the police department really wants everyone in the community to be able to verify who's a police officer and who's not, which means they can publish out that information. I choose them and trust them as a source of governance for their ecosystem. And then I can use the information they publish to verify the credentials of a police officer that shows up at my door. And so the very first way that ecosystems expand is by verifying credentials issued in a separate ecosystem. And so the cross verification of credentials is an incredibly powerful way for that to happen. It will also be important for other people to join the ecosystem by issuing credentials that are related to that ecosystem, even if not the core credential. And that's okay, and that will definitely happen. But the first thing to look out for with ecosystems is cross verification or verification outside of the traditional inside boundaries of that. There are mechanisms in governance, for example, to recommend whether that's okay to do or not for the holders of the credentials. For example, an employee can be advised that this is in fact the official benefit provider for the company instead of an imposter. But for lots of ecosystems, you want those to be as openly verifiable as possible, and both circumstances are supported by the technology. so that you can either advise users to be careful with how they share their information, or you can make it widely verifiable to spread that benefit of cross verification as far as possible.
And I think we'll see that really, or we're seeing that happening in educational credentials and in certifications and all of those sort of things where you need to prove not only who you are, but certain things about you, that you've been trained to do emergency medication, or you've been trained to a certain level of food handling, or you have actually earned a degree from the college you claim you've attended. So that, I think, is one of the immediate expansionist use cases for this technology.
Absolutely. We have, unfortunately, too many examples of education credential fraud recently that draw attention.
And then you add in, like, so for instance, the construction industry has an enormous amount of certification that needs to be constantly updated and audited. So you, with a verifiable credential, a construction worker can be have all the necessary skills that they have to work on a site. You can prove that, and you've got an audit trail so that you don't have you can operate in a risk-free environment. So yeah, this is the great sort of streamlining and simplification of all the sort of the trust activities that are essential to society moving seamlessly and without friction, and people getting things done now, as opposed to being stuck in lines or waiting on bureaucracy or waiting on the right paperwork or just scamming the system.
Yeah, no, it sounds like definitely a very good thing that I would love to be able to, like Sam mentioned, know if a cop is actually a cop, or know that my construction worker has been certified on whatever he's driving currently.
It extends further than that. I mean, we've seen sort of visions of the future where you have a spatial web in which objects, sort of the proliferation of sensors and cameras enable digital objects to interact with non-digital objects. So not only in a construction site can you make sure that you have the person is trained on a particular piece of machinery, but you can coordinate. You can make sure that they're only operating, or they're only using it in certain kind of coordinates. That the drone is permissioned to go through this airspace and that airspace and deliver a package to that factory in this particular spot. I mean, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the more you can trust the system, the process of interaction, the more things you can do with confidence.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sam and Trevor. I do appreciate you both taking the time to join us today. If you at home are interested in learning a bit more about decentralized identity technology, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. We'll continue to bring you smart educational content. If you'd like for us to cover any specific topics, please go ahead and leave them below in a comment. We'll be sure to read and address them. And thank you again to you, Sam and Trevor. If you would like to learn a little bit more, or have questions about what we've been talking about today, where would you suggest they look?
Come talk to us at Indicio. We're ready to help you with your needs. There's a huge, wide future out in front of us. The good news is that we don't have to wait for technologies to arrive. They're here, and we can begin building ecosystems today that then can expand and grow to great, powerful, and financial benefit for the participants as this technology continues to improve. So we have it today. We know how to run it. We know how it works. We have experience with governance and production deployments. And so the message is that you have an ecosystem. It needs this technology, and we'd love to help you with it.
All right.
Amen.
Awesome.